Monsieur Herge, je pense que vous, personnellement, qui êtes l'auteur d'un personnage si connu, vous n'êtes pas tellement connu physiquement, on vous connaît peu.
This is the fascinating story of Georges Remy, alias Herge, a press cartoonist who became a legend and a monument of comic book culture. His drawings reach record prices in auction houses and are today among the most expensive comic book artworks in the world. Tintin albums have been translated into almost 90 languages and are read everywhere in the world.
We're talking about 200 million copies of the Tintin books have been sold. More than 1 million are published every year. I mean, it is amazing. Then he said he was pinching himself to see how this was happening. He wouldn't believe it now. Pas possible, he would say. Absolutely impossible. Couldn't be.
Herge said Tintin is me. Would you believe that I've put my whole life into Tintin? And my whole life obviously means that he really sacrificed a lot for Tintin.
What's wonderful with Tintin is that Herge conveyed much more than he might ever have imagined. The character takes priority in some ways. Herge created something bigger than himself.
Who was Georges Remy, whose creature became much more famous than the man who created him? This is the astonishing story of an artistic genius who lived as best he could in the shadow of Tintin. My childhood seems very grey to me, Georges Remy used to say. Born in 1907 into a middle-class Catholic family in Brussels, as a boy, Georges tried to escape from a certain darkness brought on by his mother's melancholy and his father's regular absences. When Brussels was occupied by the Germans during World War I, he overcame boredom by drawing stories of a young Belgian boy who played tricks on the occupier. The young, self-taught artist enthusiastically sketched countless figures and scenes in his notebooks. The drawings were initially signed Georges Remy, then just the initials GR. Soon enough, the budding artist reversed them, and the familiar signature Herge was born. As George himself often said, his life changed radically when he discovered the Scout movement.
Lorsque j'étais scout, j'ai dessiné une série de dessins et c'était l'histoire d'un petit chef de patrouille, la patrouille des hannetons, il s'appelait Totor. Il préfigurait évidemment Tintin, c'est ça, parce qu'il avait une tête très ronde, une mèche, mais sa mèche lui tombait comme ça un petit peu sur le front.
Herge, on a Saturday afternoon, would go to a little, what was a news cinema, Actualité cinema in Brussels. He saw his first silent films with Charlie Chaplin, and then it became all the other great heroes of his, Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, all the Mack Sennett things. And he developed this fascination in the early black and white cinema.
In silent films, everything has to be expressed through gestures, poses, and all sorts of movement. It doesn't happen through words. And obviously, it's wonderful to be able to use that in drawings. He appropriated the rules of silent film and used them to invent a new language specifically for comics.
At the age of 18, Georges was hired by the newspaper The 20th Century, an editorial spearhead for Belgium's Catholic and nationalist right wing, run by an abbot, Norbert Wallet.
Herge was very, very young at that point, 21 or 22. He was just a kid. But he discovered a mentor who told him, OK, you're going to do that. We're going to train our readers to become good Catholics, good 20th century Catholics, meaning good conservative Catholics.
Abbé Wallet had an idea that he presented to Herge. Why not create a character like Totor for the paper's supplement? A pictorial hero without fear and reproach, transmitting the paper's ideas. What better way to educate its young readers? The Adventures of Tintin, a reporter at the Petit 20e, accompanied by the faithful Snowy, were first published on January the 10th, 1929. Playing with the codes of the written press, with drawings replacing an article and photographs, Herge participated in the invention of modern comics.
Herge himself, because he worked in a newspaper, he knew all about how newspapers work. The 20e siècle, being a national newspaper, it had all international editions there, so he could see big names on the newspaper who would send their stories from far-flung places where exciting things were happening. And he thought this was tremendous. And obviously, as a young man, he would have loved to have done that himself. But what did he do? He creates Tintin, who he offers that job.
Tintin would embody investigative journalism for youngsters, an intrepid reporter traveling the globe to bring back his sensational stories in pictures. Young Tintin's first destination, chosen by Abbé Wallet, was Soviet Russia, the new communist regime which so appalled Europe's Catholic conservatives. In his first appearances in the Petit 20e, the young hero's hair is brushed forward. But suddenly, after a brisk car chase, his quiff stands up straight and would continue to do so. A quiff of blonde hair, standing upright. Soon to become the hero's most recognizable feature in his ever more exciting adventures from one week to the next.
He created a unique mix of adventure, action and burlesque humor, which had never existed before in that form. Notably by imposing a very rapid pace. When I read Tintin in the Land of the Soviets today, the story is aged, but we can still feel the pace. From the outset, Tintin has to cross a river, then snow-covered landscapes, and something happens, and then something else, and finally he escapes by plane. The non-stop movement is quite simply unprecedented. It was completely new at the time.
The Tintin success was amazing. It sold out the first issue on January the 10th, 1929. So the publisher, the newspaper, decided to double the print run for the next week. Sold out. Trebled it for the next week. It sold out. He was becoming instantly known in the French-speaking world already in his first year in 1929.
In just a few months, the Petit 20e's intrepid reporter became the newspaper's star feature. There was no question of ending his adventures. The thousands of readers of the youth supplement couldn't wait to find out which continent Tintin and Snowy would take them to next.
He'd been to Russia, which was fine. And now Herge wanted to send him to America, because you couldn't have one without the other. And things were happening in America. There was a lot of talk about Al Capone and gangsters, etc. But Abbé Wallet, who was obviously an advocate of Catholicism, and for whom Belgium's colony, the Congo, was very important in terms of the missionaries' civilizing influence, didn't see things the same way as Herge. He said, it would be good now to send him to the Congo, so he can take stock of what our companions are doing to bring civilization to the darkies.
In Tintin's early adventures, Herge didn't really have a pre-established script. Each week, he would simply dream up a new twist in the tale. As in the land of the Soviets, Tintin's only assistant was his faithful friend Snowy, a wily fox terrier who would play a key role in the exotic adventure in the Belgian Congo.
Herge had never been to the Congo. He researched it as best he could, and above all, he listened to what was being said. And at that time, like the French and other countries too, the Belgians were colonialists. Those were the times, and so it was something of a caricature, and looking back now, rather unpleasant. That vision of the Congolese is obviously not at all what it should have been.
Je ne me suis même pas documenté, j'avais simplement comme référence tout ce que racontaient les anciens coloniaux. Ce sont de grands enfants, ils sont paresseux, il faut de temps en temps un petit coup de chicotte pour les faire avancer, etc. Voilà comment ça se voyait. Mais donc sans aucune idée préconçue, ni raciste, ni rien du tout. Enfin, en fait, c'était du racisme, mais sans le savoir.
In hindsight, Herge came to consider that certain scenes were not acceptable. A lesson in geography, for example, glorifying Belgium, would be replaced by a simple maths class. In view of Tintin's popularity among the paper's younger readers, Abbé Wallet suggested that Herge publish an album of the young reporter's adventures. And so, In the Land of the Soviets was published in 1930, Tintin in the Congo in 1931, and then Tintin in America, which he had finally managed to visit in 1932. The imaginary scout returned in a burlesque transatlantic adventure combining Far West cowboys and Chicago gangsters in a comic tradition born in the USA just a few years before.
It's the essence of comics, which were always intended to be comical and funny. The humor was more important than the story, which was secondary. At the end of each page, something funny had to happen, like someone falling over or something being knocked down.
S'il y a une scène de violence, il y en a parfois, parce que les enfants adorent ça au fond, ils adorent de voir du mouvement, il faut que ça soit mouvementé. J'essaie de corriger toujours ça par l'humour, c'est-à-dire si un monsieur attrape un coup de poing, eh bien on voit des étoiles, ou bien il tombe d'une façon cocasse, ou il fait une réflexion, ou on fait une réflexion pour corriger l'effet trop brutal de la scène.
Georges Remy was doing well, both professionally and in his private life. After months of patient courtship, he managed to win the woman he loved, Germaine, Norbert Wallet's secretary. After a brief engagement, Georges and Germaine were married at the Saint-Roch Church in Laeken in July 1932. Germaine would be his principal assistant and a valuable advisor. Georges was ambitious and set up a graphics and advertising company, believing that his talent and vocation lay principally in illustrations and posters.
Up to a certain age, probably about 28 or 29, Herge was convinced that his professional career would be in advertising and posters, not in comics or bande dessinée in French, a term that didn't even exist at that time.
À cette époque-là, n'existe même pas.
Georges Remy was a workaholic. In addition to his graphics work, he was a mainstay of the Petit Vingtième's operation. Every week he had more and more drawings to do to fill the paper's 16 pages. Notably the cover, various illustrations, and a double-page Tintin story.
When we see the time Herge spent working in any one week, I don't know how it was possible. He did 2 pages of Tintin and one with Quick and Flupke. He drew the covers and other things. I don't know how it was possible to work so much and to obtain such extraordinary results.
In 1934, Georges finally managed to free himself from Abbé Wallet's political directives. He was finally the master of a creature he could develop and shape little by little. The Tintin albums were now published by Casterman, beginning with the reporter's adventures in the Middle East on the trail of a mysterious secret society. Herge gradually improved his narrative style and invented what would be called Tintin's family. Inspired notably by his own father, who had a twin brother, he created the police officers Thompson without a P and Thompson with a P, in French Dupont and Dupont, who would henceforth be regulars, adding to the comedy in the adventures. Georges Remy was finding his way. Alone at his desk, he was now preparing an album that would mark the history of comics and cartoons.
He could have stayed as he was, in a narrow, limited and stereotypical vision of society, highly politicized, but paradoxically, it was Tintin that gave Herge a much broader viewpoint. In the early albums, Tintin spoke to practically nobody, and in fact, he didn't have a mouth. But as he met more people, Tintin became someone who was increasingly attentive to others. The turning point was obviously the Blue Lotus, with Tintin meeting Chang, corresponding to Herge meeting a Chinese friend, also called Chang, who was an artist of his own age.
Jusqu'à présent, dessiner des aventures de Tintin, c'était un jeu, c'était une très petite farce. Mais à ce moment, j'ai rencontré un jeune Chinois, dont le nom était Chang Chongzhen, et qui m'a ouvert les yeux sur la civilisation chinoise, et qui m'a fait mieux prendre conscience d'une sorte de responsabilité que j'avais vis-à-vis des lecteurs. C'est à partir de ce moment-là que j'ai accordé une plus grande importance aux détails, à la documentation, et faire en sorte que les histoires soient plus justes, plus vraies.
Inspired by Chang's calligraphy, which Chang himself taught him, in 1934, Herge drew Shanghai as it had never been depicted before. Chang himself came every Sunday to paint the ideograms on the drawings prepared by Georges. Above all, Chang convinced his friend that the Chinese were being treated unjustly. Caught between corrupt and racist Western colonialists who were occupying Shanghai, and the aggressive Japanese who were preparing to invade his country. And so real-life politics suddenly came to life in the adventures of Tintin, who chose his side. Herge denounced Japan's military intervention and the occupation of part of China. His friend and colleague Chang appeared as a fictional character in an historic encounter with Tintin. Like paper doppelgangers, Tintin and Chang sealed the friendship of Herge and his young Chinese friend.
It was a magic moment, the Blue Lotus. When I see the original drawings, I'm moved, they're extraordinary. Firstly, I think Herge is a great black and white draftsman. That can't be overstated. And obviously that's where I see the artist as being unbeatable, at his best. Some of the pages are breathtaking, specifically in the mastery of the black and white. And the original prints have these little blue washes which are quite disconcerting. They're very beautiful. I'd love to see a facsimile edition of the originals with the washes. It would be a comic book that everyone should have in their library because, and it's very rarely that one can say this, something happens when you look at those original drawings.
Georges Remy was at the peak of his powers. His narrative system was now well established. Just 29 years old, the young man from Brussels had invented his own graphic style, la ligne claire, or the clear line, which would influence generations to come. This concept was so called by a Dutch artist, Just Swarte, who was himself influenced by Georges Remy's original style.
In fact, for the catalogue of an Herge exhibition in Rotterdam in 1976, we were looking for a powerful title. And I thought La Ligne Claire was ideal. When we talk about the Ligne Claire, we're talking about a drawing style, where we're not using shadow, and contours are drawn with strong lines of equal width.
Doubts or shades don't exist with Herge. From a graphical point of view, this is pursued to the extent that in Herge's drawings there are no shadows. Each scene, each panel is perfectly lit. And with these clearly drawn lines, ultimately the drawings almost attain the purity of signs. Signs and pictograms are universally understood elements. In my view, he invented something that relates to a universal language through images. It's the reason why his comics can be read around the world in the most diverse cultures.
For Herge, the ligne claire was above all a matter of legibility and narrative effectiveness. The Adventures of Tintin were similar to detective or spy films, dramatic yarns steeped in reality. The Broken Ear is based on the conflict between Bolivia and Paraguay, which was making the news at the time. The Black Island was based on attempts by Nazi spies to destabilize Great Britain through the mass distribution of counterfeit money. In King Ottokar's Scepter, Herge's drawings related the perils of expansionist policies in Europe.
I particularly loved King Ottokar's Scepter, another wonderful anti-fascist book, just as The Blue Lotus was against the fascism and imperialism which the Japanese were imposing on the Chinese. We have the Ottokar's Scepter, which is a story of a failed attempt of a fascist dictatorship to take over a neighboring small country with a king. And of course the villain, who we never see, but the villain is Mussler, combination of Mussolini and Hitler. It's this wonderful way Herge relates world events, things which are happening, to the stories.
Georges was a pacifist. Through a character named Mr. Bellum appearing on the front cover of the Petit Vingtième, he attempted to denounce Hitler as a danger and announce his own opposition to another world war. But it was too late. Tintin was swept aside by the chaos of war, and his adventures for the moment were over.
Allemandes venaient déferler sur la Hollande, la Belgique et le Luxembourg, violant ouvertement leur neutralité.
Like thousands of Belgians, Georges and his wife Germaine took to the road and sought exile in France. But after France collapsed, there was nowhere else to go. The couple returned to Brussels, now occupied by the Nazis. It was during these troubled times that Herge would draw and publish some of the masterpieces that made Tintin a legend.
The war changed many things for Herge in the sense that the invasion of Belgium caused the 20e siècle paper to disappear, and the Petit Vingtième too, and so he lost his regular publication medium.
The thousands of Tintin readers were a much sought-after audience, however, and several newspapers tried to hire him. He refused an offer from the Rexist party founded by Léon de Grelle, Belgium's far-right Catholic party, which had sought to use his drawings for some years. But he agreed to work for Le Soir, the leading national daily, which was launching a youth supplement. This decision to publish his drawings under the occupation would be held against Herge for a long time.
He agreed to work for Le Soir, which was an important paper but was obviously controlled by the occupier. All the papers published during the occupation were controlled by the occupier.
And so it was in Le Soir's daily youth supplement that Tintin returned.
What happened during the war was that Herge continued to be dominated by his character and his comic creations. It was all he could see. He was living in a bubble in which Tintin was the principal inhabitant.
His new adventure took place far from war-torn Europe, surrounded by sand and sea against a backdrop of opium smuggling. In his notebooks, where he wrote the first version of his scenarios, Herge imagined an exotic detective story with no reference to the World War. The crab with the golden claws marks a key turning point in Tintin history, particularly for the appearance of a new character who would change the reporter's destiny.
J'avais besoin d'un capitaine de bateau, d'un capitaine ivrogne. J'ai fait de longs croquis, des quantités de croquis pour essayer de trouver ce personnage. Comment vous expliquer? Ben simplement, il est né de ces croquis et il n'était d'abord qu'ivrogne, uniquement. Et il buvait vraiment beaucoup.
Captain Haddock can do everything that Tintin can't. He can swear, and there's even a dictionary of his curse words. He can drink. Tintin first meets him when he's a fully fledged alcoholic, and in the following albums there is always a time when Haddock loses control and grabs a bottle. It's the sign that something serious is happening, as if real life were intervening in the story.
The Crab with the Golden Claws was a success, but the 10th Tintin story, The Shooting Star, also published during the occupation, would be more controversial. Beginning in an apocalyptic atmosphere, reflecting conditions in war-ravaged Brussels, The Shooting Star is a fascinating science fiction adventure. What Herge was criticized for was his conciliatory portrayal of scientists from Axis countries or neutral states such as Switzerland and Portugal, and above all, the caricatural depiction of the story's baddie, an American financier with a Jewish name.
Il ne faut pas oublier que les dessins de Tintin, tous les personnages de Tintin sont des caricatures. Je reviens à l'image qu'on m'a reprochée, c'est celle du financier juif dans l'Étoile mystérieuse. Je reconnais que le moment était très mal choisi pour faire une chose pareille. C'était à l'époque où commençaient ces persécutions contre les juifs. À ma décharge, je dois dire que je les ai connu que très peu, j'ai entendu parler de certaines choses, mais on a vraiment compris l'ampleur et l'horreur de ce qui s'était passé qu'après la guerre.
L'Étoile mystérieuse.
The Shooting Star is less concerned with propaganda than Tintin in the Congo, Tintin in America, or Tintin in the land of the Soviets. The Shooting Star is above all the story of a chase. If you wanted to demonstrate that there was a strong ideological intention there, you'd have a hard time because there is no ideology in the story.
The stories were now published in Le Soir in a format of just 4 panels. Paper shortages led to the demise of the youth supplement and also put paid to any hopes of publishing The Shooting Star in a 120-page album. Casterman wanted to halve the number of pages. In exchange, the publisher offered to print the album in color. It would be a revolution, they said. In order to use his original drawings and to preserve the legibility and clarity of the ligne claire, Georges found a solution. The colors would be printed separately from the black. On the reproduction of a page where the lines had become blue-gray, the colors would be applied by hand, then printed first. The black lines were then added to the color images. The ligne claire enclosed the areas of color and perfectly outlined every element within the drawing.
He encouraged his editor and the printers to get the highest quality possible. He knew all the techniques that were used very well. The hardbound 64-page album, which is something of a standard, it was Herge who contributed to that.
The adventures of Tintin continued uninterrupted in Le Soir. The Crab with the Golden Claws appeared in 1941, The Shooting Star in 1942, The Secret of the Unicorn and Red Rackham's Treasure in 1943. The Secret of the Unicorn, which begins at a famous flea market in Brussels, is the story of a timeless and exotic quest. The quest for a treasure, and above all, for origins and roots. This time, Herge doesn't focus on Tintin, but on Captain Haddock, on the trail of his ancestors. With the splendid panels of pages of The Secret of the Unicorn, Herge perfected his coloring methods. The clear line technique surrounding the flat colors enhanced the readability of the panels by giving equal priority to every element in the drawing, whether in the background or the foreground.
Herge said that his job was that of an illuminator. There's something very laborious about putting all these panels together, making sure they're well drawn, clean and readable. And so there's a homemade craft element to it. It's very demanding, and on a daily basis, it requires an incredible discipline.
After the Thompsons and Captain Haddock, Herge completed Tintin's family in Red Rackham's Treasure with an ingenious egghead, an odd little academic inspired by the explorer Auguste Piccard.
Ce qui vous intéresse, c'est de savoir quand nous partons, et cette question, je ne pourrai pas vous répondre. Nous partirons de Bruxelles avec tout notre matériel quand tout sera prêt.
Professor Cuthbert Calculus, an absent-minded and half-deaf physicist, suddenly appears with his ingenious inventions. A character destined to become an inexhaustible source of gags and misunderstandings.
The figures around Tintin, his friends, what you call in French la famille Tintin, all the characters around him, they are very realistic. You see every wrinkle on Captain Haddock's face, every detail about Professor Calculus. It's all terribly, terribly detailed, but also the key thing, which is more important, is the hero, Tintin, is wonderfully vague. He's an anonymous figure with the round head, just the quiff, the two dots, the little nose. And what's so clever about that is that any reader can identify with Tintin. So it's a brilliant combination of the central figure, Tintin, who is not well defined, and the very realistic setting of the country where the adventure is taking place and the characters around it.
Georges Remy's imaginary world was dramatically submerged by the real world when the Allies finally liberated Brussels in September 1944. A period of joyous relief was also a time of reckoning for those suspected of fraternizing with the enemy. An accusatory finger was pointed at everyone who had worked at the German-run Le Soir newspaper. Georges Remy even spent one night in jail before the authorities dropped the charges, having found nothing compromising in Tintin's adventures during the occupation.
The immediate post-war period was very hard for Herge. All at once he was caught up in reality, meaning that, like everyone else, he was made aware of the horror of the extermination camps, for example, and so, like anyone else who considered themselves to be neutral, there were questions to be answered. Did I ignore what I should have noticed? Did I deliberately not see things, etc.? And so they were troubled times for many people. And the bubble he was locked inside with Tintin finally burst. Added to that, there were depression and overwork, which is a physical ailment. There are letters which reveal that he was really sick of Tintin. He didn't want to hear about him. He saw the younger audience as a cruel monster just waiting for things to befall him. There are some very harsh words that are extremely poignant.
What had the past 20 years brought him? 20 years stuck to his desk with no time off apart from the odd Sunday. Georges had the impression life had passed him by, that he was a prisoner of his own characters and above all of Tintin, who he drew at that moment with a whip in his hand.
The drawing board is like a home. It's a personal and private place. And it's no doubt a source of pleasure and dreams for so many authors, and definitely for Herge. But it can become an instrument of torture too. It can become a source of worry and of stress.
Despite exhaustion and doubt, Herge gave a favorable response to 3 industrialists, notably to Raymond Leblanc, who suggested in the autumn of 1946 that they launch a Tintin magazine, where he would publish new adventures after a 2-year absence. The magazine gave Georges the possibility of completing a project that was close to his heart, and which reflected his state of mind at the time. A disturbing paranormal story in which the main character was the mummy of an Inca king, Raskar Capac.
The 7 Crystal Balls is one of the most frightening adventures, one of the stories most concerned with the fear of madness, which was a very personal theme for Herge. His mother, who was extremely fragile, had been interned several times and unfortunately received electric shock treatment, if one can call it treatment. In any case, it was extremely hard on her. Elisabeth Remy, Herge's mother, wouldn't survive such treatment, and she died in April 1946. The 7 Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun, perhaps metaphorically, but nonetheless quite directly, are marked by his concern and at the same time a certain tolerance for various perceptions of the world which are perhaps not the norm.
Georges' depression worsened at times, much to the dismay of the Tintin magazine personnel. He increasingly found refuge in Switzerland or at the seaside, as he couldn't find the strength to keep on drawing, and refused to continue working as the slave to a creature that was sucking the life out of him.
It's very unpredictable. What's wonderful with writers is that things just come to them. They may wonder what's going on, what's happening, and everything may be fine in some ways, but then they lose something, and they can't find that thread that they've been following so easily. It's very odd, that thread. It's a thread that connects you with childhood, a link with the childhood of the readers for whom you're writing. At times like that, you're on a tightrope, but you're able to balance and juggle with so many things.
Vous vous amusez à écrire ces histoires?
Oui, parfois, pas toujours. Pas toujours, parce que c'est parfois fatigant et il y a des jours où on est moins en train que d'autres. Mais en général, c'est amusant, oui. La création elle-même est toujours une chose amusante, même si on souffre un peu.
To protect himself from overwork, Georges made a decision. He created a refuge with Germaine, a real retreat in a large house in Serroux-Mousti in the countryside outside Brussels. The image was one of a well-settled, satisfied couple. Georges believed his country retreat could stave off his existential anguish. A second and vital decision was to create a better workplace, with a team to assist him. The Studio Herge was set up in Brussels in 1950. Georges could now count on other artists to create his backgrounds and settings, and colorists to complete the painstaking job of hand-painting every panel in a Tintin story. The studio team enabled Herge to concentrate on what he preferred, drawing his characters and dreaming up incredible new adventures.
In a way, Tintin led him on, he was larger than life, and he had an incredible intuition for finding whatever enabled the character and his world to grow. He realized that each album was an adventure for Tintin, but also an adventure for himself. He was looking for something. It had to be exciting, every page had to be new and inventive. He had to create and surprise himself.
Largely thanks to the team around him, Herge was able to imagine a futuristic adventure that demanded a good deal of scientific research and technical drawings that were unprecedented for comic books. In 1953, 16 years before Neil Armstrong, Tintin walked on the moon. Herge and his heroes were now ahead of their time. Readers were thrilled by the two-volume story, and the albums were phenomenally successful. The teamwork organization really proved itself in The Calculus Affair. Herge had become a master in script writing and plot breakdown, borrowing the most effective framing and sequencing techniques from the cinema. In The Calculus Affair, the panels are like perfectly framed film shots, building the intensity of each scene to a cliffhanger situation, encouraging the readers to turn the page. The global success of Tintin's adventures, now translated into numerous languages, did little to appease Georges. After 25 years of marriage, his relationship with Germaine was constantly deteriorating. Georges succumbed to the charms of a young colorist at the studios, Fanny Vlaminck. The sudden attraction led to a relationship as of autumn 1956. As a scout, steeped in the values of honor and fidelity, Georges felt guilty and was ill at ease in his double life. He worked harder than ever and came up with an album that was perhaps the most personal and poignant in the series.
J'ai voulu faire une histoire dans laquelle n'entre aucune violence. C'est une histoire d'amitié. Le Tintin a un ami qui est un petit chinois et il est perdu dans l'Himalaya, il va le chercher, c'est tout. Et il n'y a pas de mauvais, il n'y a pas d'espions, il n'y a pas de gangsters, rien. Il n'y a personne qui essaye de les empêcher d'arriver à leur but, si ce n'est les éléments, la difficulté même de l'entreprise.
Writing a story isn't something that you do artificially, just inventing a character and various events. You put your whole being into it. Tintin in Tibet really reflects what was going on in Herge's life at that point. He was wondering what to do. He was in love with someone else, but at the same time he didn't want to make Germaine unhappy. And in a certain way we can read Tintin in Tibet in that light. Tintin is certain that he can find his friend Chang alive. And that's the pretext for a battle against the elements. And ultimately, he has to go beyond his own limits. The dreams of white, torments that Herge himself experienced in his own dreams, which he noted down at the time. The white we can find in Tintin in Tibet is also very telling. It's not by chance that Herge was so fond of this episode, it was the one in which he invested himself the most.
In the end, against all the odds, Tintin finally finds Chang, and Herge regained a certain serenity, aided by Oriental philosophers who accompanied him to the Himalayas. Georges left Germaine in the autumn of 1960 and moved in with Fanny. A new life opened up at the age of 53. Far from the classic bourgeois environment of Serroux-Mousti, Georges gave vent to his passion for contemporary art. He became a keen collector and surrounded himself with abstract paintings. Frank Stella, Serge Poliakoff, Sonia Delaunay, Jean Dubuffet, the Belgian Louis van Lint, or the slash canvases of Lucio Fontana.
I remember the first time I went into his office and I saw what was on the walls. It was quite surprising. I'll tell you the most striking thing. There were some white tiles with a plastic funeral wreath underneath. A piece by Reynaud. I remember Herge explaining who Reynaud was and why he generally expressed himself using very cold images, with taboos and transgressions, etc. It can all be quite puzzling for someone who doesn't understand it. So he had that talent, that interest in certain artists, and he didn't buy things inadvisedly. He was drawn by the artistic approach as much as by the work itself.
Art was a breath of fresh air. What if he was a frustrated artist who had missed his vocation? Herge posed the question himself in the early 60s when he began painting abstract subjects.
Then he said, I would like to do this myself. I would like to see if I can do this. So in fact, he got in touch with a leading Belgian abstract artist and said, could you give me lessons? Could you instruct me? And he had sessions with him, and he did, I think, 37 abstract canvases. But the judgment of the artist who was advising him and of his friends were, it's something you enjoy doing, perhaps getting out of the system, but what you're best at doing is Tintin.
Herge realized that painting required a lifelong devotion. He laid his brushes aside, picking up his pen and Chinese ink again in order to finish another album. This was a huis clos where nothing or very little actually happens. The whole Tintin family is gathered together at Marlinspike Hall, and the vaudeville entertainment could almost have been the final album, as the Castafiore Emerald has an air of completion and contentedness about it.
When you create a family of characters, at some point readers become attached to each of them and wait for them to return. People expect to see Calculus and the Thompsons, etc., and are disappointed if one is missing. So the system becomes a little parochial. What's extraordinary with the Castafiore Emerald is that he ultimately manages to turn the system on its head and reverse everything, with an idea that I think is incredibly daring. Tintin doesn't go anywhere. As a child, you might like this story a bit less, because maybe it's too sophisticated. But when you read it now, it's quite a remarkable feat. What's wonderful with Herge is that he really believes in comics. He believes that comics can translate every type of emotion. They can make you cry and laugh and puzzle you and haunt your dreams.
Herge is a veritable author in the sense that he expresses his obsessions. He presents his vision of the world, a form of humor. He makes it a very personal form of expression, and almost unconsciously, a private journal. Tintin is an idealized projection of Herge, but Herge is as much Haddock or Calculus or even perhaps the Thompsons and Bianca Castafiore, who knows?
After 50 years of cohabitation, Herge and Tintin were reconciled. He realized that after a string of adventures begun in 1929, he had finally created a major work that would mark comic book history and no doubt art history too. To celebrate their golden anniversary, Herge made a caricature of himself and his life as a prisoner, grey-haired and chained to his drawing table.
J'ai fait ce pourquoi j'étais fait, je crois. J'aurais pu faire de la peinture, j'aurais pu faire du cinéma, j'aurais pu faire autre chose, mais enfin, j'ai fait de la bande dessinée, je l'ai fait de tout mon cœur, je crois que j'étais fait pour ça, tout compte fait.
Yes, we met first 5 years ago.
At the end of the 1970s, the modern art fan gained a passion for pop art. In his office featured paintings by Roy Lichtenstein. Andy Warhol himself made the inventor of modern comics a pop icon. But time was running out for George. He was ill. He was diagnosed with bone marrow cancer. He bought one last artwork in 1982, Bleu de Nuit, a Polaroid mosaic by Stefan de Jager, in which a ghostly double seems to emerge. Georges Rémy Herge, perhaps responsible for raising comics and cartoons to the status of the ninth art, died on March 3rd, 1983. He specified that after his death, no one else should ever create another Tintin adventure.